Well, I wanted to ask you first, we just heard that conversation about the school accountability bill. It's obviously going to be controversial. You sat in the last legislative session where there was a similar, I guess, disagreement between Senate Republicans and Assembly Republicans. What do you think of this new pitch by the Assembly Republicans?
Well, I think they're playing with fire. I don't think that the average citizen of Wisconsin realizes what we're talking about is really eliminating completely the authority of local school boards and making them subject to a political board in Madison.
You're talking about that academic review board, half of which, or more than half of which, 7 people would be from DPI or DPI appointees. The other 6 would be governor or legislative appointees. You still think that's political?
Well, I think it will be absolutely political. And, in the end, I think people care about their schools. They want their schools to improve, but they think the best way to do that is to have local control. And for the most part, I think the schools have worked very, very well, with the exception of, the new school innovations we've seen over the last 20 years, the charter and choice schools.
Could this be workable in some way in your mind?
I think it'd be very, very difficult to satisfy people in any sort of a compromise here. Quite frankly, either you believe in local control or you don't. And, I think most people who deal with educational issues appreciate the fact that this is a good deal more complicated than some people would like to believe it is. And the idea of pushing the superintendent of public instruction out of the picture, in other words, minimizing a state constitutional officer, I think in the end is going to be a disaster.
This issue of local control, because I think we've seen over the past 4 years in Wisconsin that a lot of Republican bills have taken some local control away and put in more of a state control of things. This is one example. I think a lot of people would argue Act 10 was another example.
Well, mining was certainly a good example as well.
Why do you think the party that once, I think it was one of their cornerstones of their mission and their principles, which was local control, why do you think it's shifted away from that, here at least in Wisconsin?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with a larger dynamic that's occurring nationwide. The Republican Party is certainly in the process of morphing itself into really a blending of what we used to think of as the John Birch Society and Southern Dixiecrats. If you look at the South, it's gone solidly Republican, and those people have had a huge impact on the Republican Party. So, I think about the university. We have a land-grant institution. That legislation was signed by Abraham Lincoln. And the idea was that we would focus on jobs. We would be working very hard to make sure that science and engineering, agriculture, and military science that kind of education was made available to citizens to create jobs and for the well-being of the country. Think back about Abraham Lincoln and the radical Republicans who met in Ripon, Wisconsin. I mean, they were for extending the franchise immediately to African Americans, and they thought slavery was a terrible thing. I think about Teddy Roosevelt and his concern for the environment and the great moral issue that it was. I think about Dwight Eisenhower, who was a champion of voting rights. And I think about Ronald Reagan, as you pointed out, as somebody who understood the business of governments is to govern. And to get things done, you have to find ways of working with people with differing views and to compromise and look for a way to solve problems. I'd be the last guy in the world to blame the media for the polarization that we have. I think certainly the ability to redistrict in the way that we do now is so much more powerful than in the past. It's hard to even compare the two systems. Certainly the amount of money that's available in the process is at a historic high, I think, and that's made it easier to polarize people.